True intelligence today is not mental, it's emotional. Harari reveals why. We have been measuring intelligence wrong for a very long time. Not in small or incidental ways, but in ways that are so fundamental, so deeply embedded in our educational systems, our hiring practices, our cultural assumptions about who deserves recognition and reward, that questioning them feels almost like questioning the basic grammar of how we evaluate human worth. The grammar goes something like this. Intelligence is the ability to process information quickly, to hold complex logical structures in the mind, to solve abstract problems, to learn new technical systems efficiently, to reason from evidence to conclusion with minimal error. It is something that can, at least approximately, be measured. It correlates with certain educational achievements. It predicts certain professional outcomes. And it has been, for at least a century of modern cognitive science, the primary metric by which human beings have distinguished the more capable from the less capable, the more valuable from the less valuable, the more likely to succeed from the less likely. This conception of intelligence has never been the whole story. Philosophers, educators, and observers of human behavior have always known that the person who scores highest on the test is not always the person who navigates life most successfully. That raw cognitive processing power, however impressive, leaves something essential out of the picture. But the something that it leaves out has resisted clear definition, has been difficult to measure, and has therefore been difficult to elevate to the same status as the cognitive capacities that tests and grades can at least approximately capture. We have had words for it: emotional intelligence, wisdom, social intelligence, practical intelligence, but these words have generally occupied a secondary tier in our collective hierarchy of human capacities, admired in the abstract, valued in retrospect, but rarely treated in the actual design of educational systems or professional advancement criteria as the primary form of intelligence that the current moment requires. Yuval Noah Harari's analysis of where human civilization is and where it is heading makes a specific and urgent argument for why this needs to change, and why the change is not merely philosophically overdue, but practically necessary in ways that the acceleration of artificial intelligence has made impossible to continue ignoring. The argument is not that cognitive intelligence is unimportant, or that raw information processing capacity has become irrelevant. It is something more precise and more interesting. It is that in a world where artificial intelligence is rapidly matching and in many domains already surpassing human cognitive intelligence, where the capacity to process information quickly, hold complex logical structures, solve abstract problems, and reason from evidence to conclusion is increasingly replicable by non-biological systems. The cognitive capacities that once constituted the primary definition of human intelligence are becoming, as measures of specifically human value and specifically human advantage, progressively less important. And the capacities that AI systems currently cannot replicate, and that may be genuinely most difficult for such systems to replicate even in the medium term, are precisely the capacities that have always been slightly embarrassing in the hierarchy of intelligence. The emotional ones, the relational ones, the ones that have to do not with processing information, but with being genuinely present with another person's experience, with holding complexity that is not reducible to information, with navigating situations where the most important variable is not the correct answer but the quality of the relationship within which the question is being asked. This is the specific argument Harari makes that deserves to be taken with complete seriousness, because it is not a soft, feel-good reassurance that being nice matters more than being smart. It is a hard, historically grounded, technologically informed claim about the specific direction of comparative advantage in the current era and in the era that is rapidly approaching. In the competition between human beings and artificial intelligence, the domain in which human beings are most likely to maintain genuine advantage is not the domain of logical reasoning or information processing. It is the domain of genuine emotional presence, of the specific quality of being that emerges from having a body, a history, a mortality, a capacity for suffering and joy that is rooted in biological experience rather than statistical pattern recognition. The question that matters most is not who can solve the problem faster. It is who can actually be with the person who is in pain. To understand why emotional intelligence is not merely a supplement to cognitive intelligence, but is, in the current moment, the primary form of intelligence that matters most. we need to examine what emotional intelligence actually consists of in its deepest and most practically significant forms. It is not, in its most important expressions, merely the ability to recognize emotions in others or to manage one's own emotional states with sufficient skill to avoid professional and social disaster. These are real and useful capacities, and they are genuinely part of emotional intelligence. But they are the surface of something much deeper and much harder to develop, something that Harari's analysis of the human situation points toward with increasing urgency. The deepest form of emotional intelligence is what we might call the ability to be genuinely present with reality as it actually is, including the emotional reality of another person's inner experience, without the distortions introduced by our need for comfort, our desire for the situation to be different from what it is, our anxiety about what the situation means for us, or our impatience with complexity that does not resolve quickly into something manageable. This is enormously difficult. It is difficult because the human mind, trained by millions of years of evolutionary pressure toward rapid pattern recognition and quick response, is not naturally inclined toward the kind of sustained, non-reactive presence that genuine emotional intelligence requires. It is difficult because the cultural environments most of us inhabit actively train us away from this kind of presence, rewarding speed, certainty, and decisive action over the patience, tolerance for ambiguity, and willingness to remain with discomfort that genuine emotional attunement demands. And it is difficult because the specific mechanisms of digital life in the current era have made this kind of deep presence increasingly rare by training our attentional systems toward the quick and the stimulating and the immediately resolving at the expense of the slow, the complex, and the genuinely ambiguous. And yet, this deep emotional presence is precisely what is most needed in the situations that matter most in human life, and precisely what artificial intelligence systems are currently least capable of providing. When a person is grieving, what they need is not information about grief, not a well-structured argument for why the loss they have experienced fits a recognizable pattern, not even a perfectly calibrated emotional response generated by a system that has processed millions of examples of human grief and can produce outputs statistically similar to those produced by other humans in comparable situations. What they need is another consciousness that is genuinely present with them in their specific pain, that is not managing their experience from behind a glass of professional or algorithmic distance, but that is actually there, affected, responsive, capable of the kind of genuine co-regulation that occurs between two nervous systems that are genuinely in contact with each other. This is something that the most sophisticated AI system currently available cannot provide, not because it lacks the processing power to generate appropriate verbal responses, but because it lacks the biological substrate of genuine affective presence. The actual nervous system that can be genuinely moved by another's experience in the way that genuine emotional connection requires. The same is true across a wide range of the most important human situations. When a leader must navigate an organization through a period of genuine uncertainty and fear, what is required is not primarily superior information processing or strategic brilliance, though neither of those is irrelevant. What is required is the ability to hold the emotional reality of the people in the organization with sufficient genuine presence that they feel actually seen and actually accompanied rather than managed. When a teacher must reach a student who has stopped engaging with learning, what is required is not a more efficient delivery mechanism for the curriculum content, which is already accessible through countless digital sources. What is required is a human being who can feel the specific texture of that student's resistance or confusion or fear and respond to it in a way that is genuinely responsive to this specific student rather than to a statistical composite of similar students. When a doctor must deliver difficult news to a patient, what is required is not primarily clinical accuracy, which is necessary but not sufficient. What is required is a human being capable of being genuinely present with the patient's fear, capable of holding the weight of the situation with them rather than managing it from behind the armor of professional distance. In all of these situations, and in countless others like them that constitute the most important moments of human life, the primary determinant of whether the encounter is adequate to the human need it is addressing is not cognitive intelligence in the conventional sense. It is something that belongs in a different register entirely, something that has to do with the quality of presence, the genuineness of the engagement, the willingness to be genuinely affected by the reality of another person's experience. And this something is what genuine emotional intelligence, in its deepest and most practically significant forms, actually is. Harari's historical perspective illuminates why this particular form of intelligence has been so systematically undervalued, and why the undervaluation has become, in the current moment, so consequential. The devaluation of emotional intelligence relative to cognitive intelligence is not an arbitrary cultural preference or a random historical accident. It has specific historical roots in the development of the industrial economy and the specific forms of human capacity that industrial economy rewarded most directly. The factory floor did not reward emotional sensitivity or the ability to be genuinely present with the complexity of another person's experience. It rewarded the ability to perform specific cognitive and physical tasks reliably, repeatedly, and efficiently. The bureaucratic organization that developed alongside the industrial economy rewarded the ability to process information according to established rules, to apply standard procedures, to categorize situations, and to produce consistent outputs in response to specific inputs. These are capacities that are structurally closer to the cognitive end of the intelligence spectrum, and the educational systems that evolved to serve the industrial economy were designed accordingly to develop and measure them. The problem is that those educational systems have persisted, and the cultural values they encode have persisted, into an era when the industrial economy they were designed to serve is being transformed by precisely the technologies that are most capable of replicating the cognitive capacities those systems developed. The educational system that rewards the student who can memorize and apply information most accurately and quickly, who can perform well on tests that measure the kind of logical and analytical reasoning that has been the primary currency of educational evaluation for over a century, is producing graduates optimally suited for the jobs that artificial intelligence is most rapidly eliminating. It is simultaneously failing to develop and assess the capacities, the specifically human emotional and relational capacities, that are least replicable by current AI systems and that are most needed in the situations that will continue to require human involvement. This is one of the most significant misalignments in contemporary educational policy, and it is a misalignment that is becoming more consequential every year as the displacement of cognitive labor by artificial intelligence accelerates. Teaching children to be better information processors in an era when information processing is being outsourced to machines is not preparation for the future. It is preparation for the past. What actually prepares young people for the world they will inherit is the development of the specifically human capacities that machines cannot replicate, and those capacities are primarily emotional and relational rather than cognitive in the narrow sense. The ability to sustain genuine attention to another person's experience, the ability to tolerate ambiguity and complexity without premature resolution, the ability to navigate difficult conversations with honesty and care, the ability to maintain authentic relationship across difference and disagreement, the ability to feel the moral weight of a situation, not merely to calculate its optimal resolution. These are the capacities that will matter most in the era that is coming, and they are the capacities that current educational systems are least equipped to develop. What does it actually take to develop emotional intelligence in its deepest and most practically significant forms? This is a question that turns out to be both more specific and more demanding than the popular conception of emotional intelligence, with its emphasis on self-awareness and empathy, often suggests. The deepest form of emotional intelligence is not primarily a set of skills that can be acquired through instruction or practiced in the way that a musical technique or a mathematical procedure can be practiced. It is a way of being in relation to experience that develops through specific kinds of encounter with difficulty, with loss, with situations that cannot be managed or controlled, with the experience of genuine vulnerability and genuine dependence, with the practice of sustained attention to inner experience. and with the specific quality of relationship that comes from being genuinely known by another person over time. This means that some of the experiences that are most uncomfortable and most actively avoided in a culture oriented toward optimization and control are precisely the experiences that are most developmentally important for the kind of intelligence that matters most. Grief, properly engaged with rather than managed or prematurely resolved, develops the capacity for genuine presence with suffering that is fundamental to deep emotional intelligence. Failure, experienced fully rather than immediately reframed as a learning opportunity, develops the kind of genuine humility that makes authentic relationship possible. Conflict, navigated with honesty rather than managed for comfort, develops the capacity for the kind of difficult conversation that honest human relationship requires. Boredom, tolerated rather than immediately resolved with stimulation, develops the attentional capacities that genuine presence requires. These are not comfortable developmental experiences, but they are formative ones, and a culture that systematically insulates people from them, that treats discomfort as a problem to be solved rather than a teacher to be attended to, is producing people who are cognitively capable and emotionally underdeveloped in precisely the domains that matter most for the era ahead. There is also a specific dimension of emotional intelligence that Harari's analysis highlights as particularly important in the context of the current technological transformation, and that is the capacity for what we might call existential honesty, the ability to hold genuinely difficult truths about the human situation, including one's own, without the defensive distortions that make those truths more bearable but less useful. The most important questions facing humanity in the current era, questions about the nature of consciousness in artificial systems, about the moral status of designed beings, about the meaning of work in an automated economy, about the kind of belonging that is possible for people whose communities have been dissolved by economic and technological forces, about how to live meaningfully in the face of uncertainty about the most fundamental features of human existence, are not questions that can be adequately engaged with by people who are relating to their own experience primarily through the distorting lens of what they need it to be rather than what it actually is. Existential honesty is a form of emotional intelligence because it requires the willingness to feel fully the weight of difficult realities, to remain in genuine contact with experiences that are uncomfortable and unresolved, rather than managing them through the various forms of cognitive and emotional escape that are always readily available. It is not the same as pessimism or despair. It is the specific quality of honest engagement with reality that is the prerequisite for both genuine wisdom and genuine compassion, because genuine wisdom requires seeing what is actually there rather than what we wish were there, and genuine compassion requires the ability to be actually moved by another's reality rather than to process it from behind the glass of managed professional distance. The relationship between emotional intelligence and the specific quality of leadership that the current moment requires is also worth examining carefully. The 20th century model of leadership was organized primarily around cognitive dominance, the leader as the person in the room who knows the most, processes information most quickly, and makes decisions most decisively. This model had a certain functionality in environments where the primary challenges were ones that superior cognitive processing could address, where the variables were definable, the outcomes measurable, and the right answers, if not always obvious, at least in principle discoverable by sufficiently rigorous analysis. These conditions characterize significant portions of the organizational environments that the 20th century economy produced, and the leadership styles they generated were reasonably well matched to them. But the environments that are characteristic of the current moment are different in ways that matter for the kind of intelligence leadership requires. The most important challenges facing organizations and communities and nations in 2026 are not ones for which superior cognitive processing reliably produces superior outcomes, because they are genuinely complex in the technical sense that systems scientists use the word, characterized by multiple interacting variables whose relationships are not fully understood, whose behavior cannot be adequately predicted by models based on historical data, and whose outcomes are sensitive to small changes in initial conditions in ways that make confident prediction systematically unreliable. In these conditions, the cognitive dominance model of leadership is not merely insufficient, it is actively counterproductive. because the confidence it projects discourages the kind of genuine collective intelligence that complex problems require, and the decisiveness it models suppresses the expression of the distributed knowledge and diverse perspectives that are the only adequate response to genuine complexity. What these conditions require is a different kind of leadership, one organized not around cognitive dominance, but around the ability to create and hold the kind of relational space in which genuine collective intelligence can emerge. This requires, above all, the emotional intelligence to remain genuinely present with uncertainty, without projecting false confidence, to listen in ways that actually transmit the information that diverse perspectives contain rather than simply performing the appearance of listening, to maintain authentic relationship across the disagreements and conflicts that genuine collective engagement with difficult problems necessarily generates, and to hold the emotional reality of the people being led with sufficient genuine care that they are willing to contribute their actual knowledge and their actual doubts rather than the curated version of both that political self-protection produces. These are capacities that belong unambiguously in the emotional register, and they are the capacities that the most important forms of leadership in the current era most centrally require. Harari has also pointed toward a specific connection between emotional intelligence and the specifically human capacity for moral reasoning that deserves careful attention. The question of how to act morally, of how to navigate situations where competing values generate genuine conflict, where no rule or principle produces a clearly correct answer, where the specific texture of a particular situation matters more than any general principle that might be applied to it, is a question that is not primarily cognitive in character, however much sophisticated moral philosophy might be brought to bear on it. It requires the ability to feel the weight of the competing values at stake, to be genuinely affected by the impact of different possible choices on the actual people whose lives would be shaped by them, to remain in genuine contact with the moral complexity of the situation rather than resolving it prematurely through the application of a rule that makes the decision easier but less adequate to the actual situation. Artificial intelligence systems can be trained to make decisions consistent with specified ethical principles. They can process moral rules and apply them with remarkable consistency and speed. What they cannot do, at least not in any way that currently exists or is obviously on the horizon, is be genuinely morally present in the way that genuine moral reasoning requires. They cannot feel the weight of what is at stake in the way that feeling is required for genuine moral engagement, not as a supplement to the reasoning but as its very substance. Genuine moral intelligence is a form of emotional intelligence, and the inability of artificial systems to replicate it is not merely a technical limitation to be eventually overcome, but may be a fundamental feature of the difference between biological and artificial forms of cognition. The practical implication of all of this for how people should think about their own developments and their own preparation for the era ahead is specific and in some ways uncomfortable. The investments that are most likely to matter for genuine human flourishing and genuine human relevance in the coming decades are not primarily investments in cognitive skill development, in the acquisition of technical knowledge or analytical capability, though neither of these things is irrelevant. They are investments in the kinds of experience, practice, and relationship that develop genuine emotional intelligence in its deepest and most practically significant forms. Investing in the quality and depth of your relationships rather than in the number and breadth of your connections. Investing in the practices, whatever they might be for you specifically, that develop genuine attentional presence, that train the capacity to remain with experience rather than fleeing it, that cultivate the kind of sustained inner attention that makes genuine responsiveness to another person's reality possible. Investing in the honest engagement with your own emotional experience, the willingness to feel fully what is actually happening rather than managing it into something more comfortable. That is the prerequisite for genuine emotional presence with others. Investing in the quality of your engagement with difficulty, loss, and failure as developmental experiences rather than as problems to be solved and moved past as quickly as possible. None of these investments are easy to quantify. None of them produce the kind of visible, measurable credentials that the systems through which people are currently evaluated for professional and social advancement are designed to recognize. They are investments in the kind of intelligence that has been most systematically undervalued by the institutional frameworks of the past century, and yet they are In Harari's analysis, the investments that are most likely to produce genuine human flourishing in the era that is coming, precisely because they develop the specifically human capacities that will matter most when the capacities that can be replicated by artificial systems have been largely outsourced to those systems. The person who has developed genuine emotional intelligence in this deep sense, who can be actually present with another person's experience, who can navigate genuine complexity without premature resolution, who can hold the emotional weight of difficult situations without being destroyed by it, who can maintain authentic relationship across disagreement and conflict, who can be genuinely moved by the moral weight of specific situations rather than applying rules from behind a glass of emotional distance, is not merely a nicer or more empathetic version of the cognitively intelligent person. They are a different and more complete kind of intelligence, the kind that the era ahead most centrally requires, and that no artificial system currently on any imaginable horizon is capable of replacing. The most intelligent response to the current moment is not to compete with artificial intelligence on the terrain where artificial intelligence is strongest. It is to develop most fully the capacities that are most distinctively human, not because they are human, but because they are precisely in this era most genuinely useful, most genuinely needed, and most genuinely irreplaceable. Those capacities are emotional, they are relational, they are rooted in the specific, embodied, mortal, vulnerable reality of being a biological creature with a history and a nervous system and the capacity for genuine suffering and genuine joy. True intelligence in the era Harari is describing is not the ability to process more information more quickly. It is the ability to be more genuinely present with reality, with other people, with yourself, with the specific weight of the specific moment you are actually inhabiting. That is not a soft consolation prize for people who cannot compete with algorithms. It is the hard, demanding, irreplaceable thing that the moment most needs. And the person who develops it fully, who invests in it deliberately and takes it seriously as the primary form of intelligence that the current era requires, is not making a retreat from the challenges of a technological age. They are making the most sophisticated possible response to those challenges. They are becoming, in the deepest and most genuinely important sense, more intelligent. Not because they are faster, because they are finally, fully, genuinely here. There is one more dimension of the relationship between emotional intelligence and the current technological moment that Harari's thinking illuminates with particular clarity, and it concerns the specific question of what it means to understand another person, a question that turns out, on examination, to be far more complex and far more important than the way it is usually framed in either popular discourse or academic psychology. We tend to think of understanding another person primarily as a cognitive achievement, as the product of having sufficient accurate information about their circumstances, their psychology, their history, their motivations, and their likely responses. This cognitive model of understanding underlies most of the ways we think about empathy in professional and organizational contexts. The training programs designed to develop empathy in healthcare workers, in managers, in customer service professionals are largely designed around the acquisition of information about how people in various circumstances are likely to feel, what they are likely to need, and what responses are likely to be most helpful or harmful. The implicit model is that empathy is a form of accurate prediction, and that accurate prediction requires accurate information, and that accurate information can be provided through instruction. Artificial intelligence is, in this model of empathy, actually quite good at it. A sufficiently sophisticated AI system, trained on enough examples of human emotional experience in enough different circumstances, can generate responses that are statistically similar to the responses that human beings with genuine empathy would generate in similar situations. It can recognize the likely emotional state of a person from verbal and nonverbal cues with accuracy that rivals that of skilled human observers. It can produce expressions of understanding and care that are indistinguishable in their surface features from those produced by genuinely empathetic human beings. And yet, there is something important that is missing from this kind of algorithmically generated empathy, something that most people can feel when they encounter it, even without being able to name it precisely. What is missing is genuine contact. The AI system's response is generated by a process of pattern matching and statistical prediction. It produces an output that resembles what a genuinely understanding response looks like, without there being any entity on the other end of the exchange that is actually present with the specific reality of this specific person in this specific moment. The difference between a genuinely understanding response and a response that resembles one is not a difference in the content of the output. It is a difference in what is actually happening in the exchange. Whether there is another consciousness that is genuinely affected by your reality, that is not merely processing information about your state, but is actually in some sense moved by it, changed by it, responsive to it in a way that goes beyond the generation of statistically appropriate outputs. This distinction matters enormously for the specific purposes that genuine emotional presence is meant to serve. The grieving person who interacts with an AI system capable of generating perfectly calibrated expressions of sympathy receives something. The grieving person who interacts with a human being who is genuinely present with their grief, who is actually affected by it, who brings to the encounter a history of their own losses and their own knowledge of what loss feels like from the inside, receives something categorically different, even if the words generated in both interactions are superficially similar. The difference is not primarily informational, it is ontological. It is the difference between being accompanied and being processed. And for the most important forms of human need, the need that arises in grief, in fear, in genuine confusion about what to do when what matters most is at stake, the difference between being accompanied and being processed is everything. This is why Harari insists against the current that runs in much contemporary thinking about human-machine interaction, that the replacement of human emotional presence with algorithmically generated facsimiles of emotional presence is not a neutral technological development whose benefits and costs are mainly economic. It is a transformation in the quality of the most important forms of human encounter. A transformation that reduces something that was genuinely irreplaceable to something that is merely functional. And the people who accept this reduction, who learn to relate to algorithmically generated expressions of care as adequate substitutes for the real thing, are not merely making a pragmatic adjustment to change circumstances. They are accepting a narrowing of what human relationship can be that is worth resisting, not because the technology is inherently malevolent, but because the thing being displaced matters in ways that the displacement itself tends to obscure. The development of genuine emotional intelligence is therefore not merely a strategy for professional relevance in an era of artificial intelligence. It is a form of resistance, a commitment to the maintenance of the specifically human forms of presence and contact that constitute the most important dimension of human life, and that are most at risk of being slowly displaced by their algorithmic approximations. The person who develops genuine emotional presence, who invests in the specific practices and relationships and experiences that make deep human contact possible, is not merely developing a career advantage. They are maintaining, in their specific life and in the specific relationships their life enables, the quality of human encounter that makes the most important forms of human flourishing possible. They are insisting, through the specific quality of their engagement with other people, that the standard of human contact is not adequacy, but genuine presence. That the measure of a human relationship is not whether it produces appropriate outputs, but whether it involves genuine meeting between two actual consciousnesses that are actually affected by each other. This is a high standard. It is more demanding than the standard of functional adequacy that the algorithmic approximations of emotional presence can meet. And it is more demanding than the standard that many people actually hold in their daily relational lives, where the pressures of time and efficiency and the habitual ways of managing the discomfort of genuine contact tend to produce a version of relationship that resembles its fullest form without actually achieving it. But it is the standard that matters. both for the quality of individual lives and for the quality of the collective life of a civilization that is in the process of determining, through a million daily choices about how to relate and what to value and what to accept as adequate. What kind of presence human beings will maintain in each other's lives as the technological mediation of those lives becomes more comprehensive and more sophisticated. The development of emotional intelligence, in the full and demanding sense that Harari's analysis points toward, is also deeply connected to a quality of relationship with one's own inner life that is becoming increasingly rare and increasingly important in equal measure. The capacity to be genuinely present with another person's experience presupposes the capacity to be genuinely present with one's own, because genuine responsiveness to another person's reality requires a kind of inner quietness, a temporary suspension of one's own agenda, anxiety, and need for the situation to be different from what it is, that is only possible for people who have developed some genuine relationship with their own inner experience rather than treating it primarily as a distraction from external tasks. This is the connection between emotional intelligence and the contemplative practices that Harari himself describes as central to his own capacity to think clearly and engage genuinely. Meditation, in the various forms it takes across different traditions, is fundamentally a practice of attending to one's own inner experience with precision and without reactivity, of developing the capacity to notice what is actually happening in one's own mind and body without immediately acting on it, judging it, or managing it into something more comfortable. This practice develops over time a quality of inner quietness and attentional flexibility that makes genuine presence with another person's experience significantly more possible, because it reduces the degree to which one's own unexamined emotional reactions, anxieties, and needs for the situation to be different from what it is dominate the encounter. The person who has developed genuine relationship with their own inner experience, who can feel their own anxiety and remain present anyway, who can notice their own discomfort with another person's pain and continue to attend to it rather than reflexively attempting to manage it away, is significantly more capable of the kind of genuine emotional presence that the most important human encounters require. There is also what we might call the social ecology of emotional intelligence, the question of what kinds of communities, what kinds of relationships, and what kinds of cultural practices create the conditions in which emotional intelligence can develop and be sustained. Human beings do not develop emotional intelligence in isolation. They develop it through specific kinds of encounter with specific other people, in specific kinds of relational contexts that create the conditions for the learning that emotional intelligence development requires. The relationships that most powerfully develop emotional intelligence are relationships of genuine depth and genuine honesty over time. Relationships in which both parties are known to each other well enough that the specifically personal dimensions of each person's emotional patterns and relational tendencies become visible, and in which there is sufficient trust and sufficient commitment to allow honest engagement with those patterns when they generate difficulty. These are the relationships that most people value most in their own lives, and that most people, in the current conditions of digitally mediated, time-pressured, geographically mobile contemporary existence, find most difficult to build and maintain. The cultural practices that most powerfully sustain the development of emotional intelligence are practices that create regular, structured opportunities for the kind of genuine human encounter that the busyness and digital mediation of contemporary life tends to crowd out. Practices of communal gathering that involve real presence, real attention, and real engagement with each other's actual experience, rather than the parallel processing of separate screens in close physical proximity that constitutes so much of what passes for togetherness in many contemporary households and communities. Practices of storytelling that create space for the honest expression of difficulty, vulnerability, and genuine uncertainty, rather than the performance of curated versions of successful living that social media tends to reward. Practices of care, of genuinely attending to people who are ill, old, grieving, or struggling, that develop the specific emotional capacities that are most needed, and that the outsourcing of care to professional and increasingly algorithmic systems tends to atrophy. These practices are not exotic or difficult to access in any material sense. They do not require special equipment or unusual skills. They require only the specific commitment to treat genuine human presence as a priority in the specific conditions of one's own life, to create the time and the relational context that genuine emotional encounter requires, and to resist the specific cultural pressures that consistently frame the investment in deep presence as a luxury that busy and productive people cannot quite afford. Resisting those pressures is itself a form of the emotional intelligence that the current moment requires, because it is a form of knowing what actually matters and acting from that knowledge rather than from the pressures of a culture organized around different values. The most powerful thing that Harari's insight about emotional intelligence ultimately reveals is something about the nature of the competition between human beings and artificial intelligence that the conventional framing of that competition obscures. The conventional framing presents it as a race, a competition in which human beings and AI systems are running in the same direction, toward the same goals, with AI increasingly pulling ahead. In this framing, the question for human beings is how to run faster, how to develop cognitive capacities that allow them to stay ahead of, or at least relevant alongside, the increasingly capable AI systems that are transforming every domain of work and knowledge. But Harari's analysis suggests that this framing is wrong, and that the wrongness of the framing is part of what makes the competitive anxiety it generates so unproductive. The most important human capacities are not in competition with artificial intelligence because they are not trying to accomplish the same things. They are trying to accomplish something different, something that the design goals of artificial intelligence systems are not oriented toward achieving, because achieving it requires a form of being that is specific to biological, mortal, vulnerable, emotionally present organisms. The competition between human cognitive intelligence and artificial cognitive intelligence is real and in most cognitive domains is going in one direction. But there is no competition between human emotional presence and artificial emotional simulation, because what genuinely emotionally present human beings offer to each other is not a form of output that can be simulated however skillfully. It is a form of genuine contact that presupposes the existence of an actual conscious entity that is genuinely there, genuinely affected, genuinely responsive in the full sense that responsiveness takes on only when it is the responsiveness of a being that actually has something genuinely at stake in the encounter. This is why true intelligence, in the era Harari is describing, is not mental in the conventional sense. Not because mental capacities are unimportant, they are not, but because the mental capacities that constitute conventional intelligence are the capacities that are most readily replicable by non-human systems, and the development of those systems is advancing faster than any individual human capacity development can match. The capacities that are genuinely, deeply, perhaps irreducibly human are the emotional ones, the ones rooted in the specific reality of being a body that can be hurt, a consciousness that can be lonely, a being that loves and loses and knows it will die and finds meaning in the face of that knowledge. These are the capacities that the era most needs. These are the capacities that no amount of additional training data or processing power will enable a machine to genuinely replicate. And these are the capacities that the person who understands clearly what the moment requires will invest in most deliberately, most seriously, and with the recognition that doing so is not a retreat from the demands of a technological era, but the most sophisticated possible engagement with them. Intelligence is not going away, it is being redefined, and the definition that matters most in the era that is coming is not the one that measures how quickly you can process information. It is the one that measures how fully you can be present with yourself, with others, with the weight of the specific, unrepeatable, mortal, irreplaceable life you have been given to live. That is what true intelligence looks like in 2026.